Hello and welcome back to On the Ground here in China. So my name's Benjamin King. I'm CEO of Kinyu SEM, supply chain focused employer of record here on the ground in China. And today we're joined by Ash Monger, founder of IMEX Sourcing Services, based here in Guangzhou, China. And welcome, Ash. Well, yeah.
Great. Thank you for having me, Ben. I'm really excited to be on this show.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be here in your office here, a lovely location in the heart of New Guangzhou. I'm really excited for today because I've known Ash for a long time. We've known each other for a long time. And I know that Ash is definitely one, a strong focus on management and process, especially when it comes to sourcing here on the ground in China. So today we're going to talk about people, process, management, and how that can really impact your sourcing operation here in China. Yeah, so Ash, first, do you want to just overview IMEX, like how you founded the company and your experience working here?
Sure, absolutely. So the company was founded in 2011, called IMEX Sourcing Services. We started off primarily focused on e-commerce sellers because before I came to China, I had a background in e-commerce. Around 2015, 2016, Amazon FBA came out and we started getting a lot of inquiries. So we positioned ourselves as a supply chain management company for e-commerce. And we had a lot of growth at that point. We launched an online portal to just create more transparency. And we always try to differentiate ourselves by being a tech-savvy supply chain management company. And gradually, as we grew, we started working with a lot of retail chains, distributors, and now we have a pretty nice, diverse mix of clients working across Europe and US, and recently quite a bit of Middle East as well. So in terms of what we do, it's essentially a fully outsourced supply chain management process, starting with due diligence, contracts, sourcing, of course, the quality control aspect, and logistics as well.
Fantastic. And you described yourself as tech savvy, and definitely going to come into that a bit more about how your team and how your operation is structured on that. So. In terms of the sourcing aspect, how have you grown your team over the last 15 years of working? How did it start from you, and then how did it expand?
Sure. So it started off as a one-person show. I hired my first employee a few weeks after starting, so it was just the two of us. And gradually, as we grew as a business, we brought on more and more people. But what we also did was got a better understanding of what our ideal client looks like. And one of the challenges with a supply chain company is it's a very manpower intensive business. You need to call suppliers, you need to go to the factory, so you need people on the ground. And what we realized was it's very easy to become a very large company serving a lot of clients, and having your effort being spread thin. So we gradually became more and more focused on what our ideal client looks like. And even though we grew the team size, we also had a better understanding of our ideal clients. So we were more selective about the clients we were working with. So now we have, I think initially when we started out, we needed a lot of people who could do a lot of things, more all-rounders. But gradually we became more and more specialized. We split sourcing from account management. We split quality control into a separate team. So I think as we've grown as a company, we've achieved more specialization, which has just improved and strengthened the team and the processes.
Yeah, that is interesting. When you mentioned about all-rounders, I know that several clients who may come to us, or lots of companies operating or trying to operate on the ground look for that sort of all-rounder type of position. I call them supplier account managers. So it's a bit like what you said, like half of it is they have that sourcing background and they work with the suppliers, but they also are that sort of interface with like the overseas team, etc. So yeah, and it's interesting how you've over time you've sort of split that into obviously sourcing specialists and then account managers. Yeah. Tell me about your first employee. What did you look for in that person? And
Yeah, so it's actually funny because my first employee is still with me. 15 years later, she left us for a while. She came back. And I just feel I got very lucky with the first employee because since then we have developed like a very sophisticated hiring process. In fact, we have negative reviews on Xiaohongshu for the length of a hiring process.
oh, really?
So, but it's really delivered some, good people. We have a very strong team, a very clear, well-articulated culture, driven by values. We're a very value-focused company. We have like 4 core values, and we use that as the basis for our hiring. But going back to the first employee, she actually was one of those all-rounders who could get a lot done. And she gradually went on to become the sourcing manager. She moved away for a few years, came back, still here. But I think in terms of what we can take away as a principle here is with your first few people, essentially it's a trade-off. Sometimes you can only afford to hire one person. So you're forced to make a trade-off in the sense that you're looking for someone who can get a lot done without being very specialized in anything. So that was a trade-off we had to make as a young company. But I always recommend anyone, if they have the resources and the right amount of scale, to get a certain degree of specialization in their teams early, because that makes everything else a lot easier in terms of quality control, communication, and a whole host of other things.
Yeah, no, that's really important. I think, especially, for us, working with clients who have obviously operations overseas, and then they start to hire people on the ground in China, looking at, they are tempted to try and package everything into one employee, and it's tricky, and we almost have to advise them against that. And there have been some examples where it's not like it doesn't work. It's just like maybe they would get so much more out of their operation if they did specialize, had someone specialized in sourcing or someone specialized in the product development or in quality control and things like that. But I know, some companies, they want to try and package all of that into one one go. But yeah, it's a great story how your first employee is still with you today. But, what do you think motivates your team? In terms of their career and the work that they're doing.
That's a good question. I think it's very important to give them a certain level of autonomy to make decisions. It's also what I think helps a lot, and I think this has become easier as you've grown as a business, is if they have a bit more of a defined career path. So one of the challenges we had when we were small was it was harder for us to have that much of a career path, because of course we could grow as a company and the people who were there would grow with that. But until, if you were hiring someone at the junior most level and they can see a couple of levels above them, it was harder. So having a defined career path helps how they can grow in the role. What I've learned is, though, autonomy makes a big difference. Can they make decisions in their role? And other than that, culture, it's a big thing for us. So we've invested a lot of time on creating a culture where people actually love going to work and they can, chit chat, have a laugh while at work. So sometimes there are companies here in China that are very strict. It has a very serious work culture, very rules driven. So sometimes you kind of kill that human element in those cultures. Mm-hmm. So that's something you try to keep alive while still having, good systems and processes to ensure that that doesn't impact the work quality. And I think we're always in the process of fine-tuning that balance. But I think when that balance works, it just makes everything else easier and people actually enjoy coming to work.
Yeah, I think that culture, it can be difficult to get the right balance, because you obviously want people to feel motivated, but like you said, a lot of it is down to them having a clear structure to their work, so that they're not worried too much about what they need to do. They've got that very clear in front of them. Just about that culture, I mean, can you give me an example of how you would, promote and develop sort of a positive culture in the workplace?
Sure. So for me, it begins with being very clear about your values. When we started off as a company, we came up with 9 core values, and we tried to look for those values in the people we hired. Some of them were more, some of them were easier to find, some of them were more difficult to find. But gradually, with each refinement of the hiring process, we found that we were able to put in little processes in place to see how closely people align with those values. And we were struggling to hire at that time because we realized it was very hard to find someone who had all 9 of those values, or even 7. So then we had to, I think at some point we had to make a practical decision saying, hey, which of these values are really, really core? So at that point, we essentially cut it down to 4 core values, which are non-negotiables for us. And everything we designed, our hiring process, was completely designed around testing for those values. And we found that if people had those values, they naturally fit in. I mean, they fit into a culture well. They got on with people. So just to give you an example, one of our core values was hunger for knowledge. So we really wanted people who are investing in themselves, people who are readers and stuff. And what we found was it was actually very hard to find people who are readers. A lot of people believe that, hey, reading is good for you, but very few people were actually doing it once they graduated from college. They were busy with their lives, they're busy with their families, so they didn't take the time to read nonfiction, especially, to read about personal development, about the industry and all that. So that was a very rare skill. So we realized that was a limitation of the market, the culture. So we renamed that value. We asked ourselves, what's the raw ingredient behind hunger for knowledge? And we came to the conclusion it's curiosity. So we started looking for people who ask a lot of questions. They're curious about things. And that made hiring a bit easier. And when these people came into the company, we realized that some of them we were able to turn into readers because they had the raw ingredient. And when they saw other people around them, they're benefiting from it, they're reading. When they got the value from the first couple of books they read, that process came naturally to them. So they had the raw ingredient, but they just hadn't had the exposure. So that's one example. And then when you come into a company and you meet people who have shared values, it just becomes a lot easier to get on with people. So everything falls into place itself. So for me, building a culture is if you can identify the values and find the people who are living those values, everything else just becomes a lot easier.
Yeah, that's really quite powerful, actually. I mean, I think a lot of companies, they probably have their values in their mind. I mean, I think that maybe from a recruitment process, they might see what they call as a cultural fit of a person or a partner, but do they have that written down, and do they have that in their recruitment process?
Yeah.
And like you said, I can imagine that going through that long recruitment process is where you try and really understand what people's core values are.
Yeah. And it's, the thing with values is it's an ongoing process because you have to constantly think about, hey, what else can I do to find people who have these values, and how else can I discover them? But it's like compound interest, because when you have people who are living those values, when they are doing the interviews for their directs, they look for the same thing.
Yeah.
So it just, the culture builds over time because people tend to hire people who have similar values to them. Mm-hmm. So the key point there is then your first few hires become really, really critical. If you can get those right, then it just becomes easier for the future hires to be more aligned.
Because those first hires, sort of, even they might not necessarily be the most senior people, but they do become sort of internal champions in terms of having walked the walk with the founder and as the team at the beginning on developing that culture. And so I think, future hires tend to sort of follow suit, really.
Yeah. And I think a great related point is that when people come into the company, they adapt very quickly to the culture of the company. So they will take cues from how other people are doing things in this company to see how they need to behave.
Yeah.
So that's the beautiful thing about culture when it's working, and at least a majority of your people are. So, for example, if in a company gossiping is not normal, right? Because we created a culture where it's highly discouraged through repetition, not only by having it in policy, but by taking action early. So I mean, chit-chatting is a different thing, but if you're gossiping about another person, we don't want to create that kind of culture. So we crack down on that early. So when someone new comes in who might have seen that was normal in another company, and they come in here and they see no one does that, people adapt quickly, and the culture kind of largely stays on. Every now and then you would have someone who would be very talented, but they would be a threat to your core values. And I think at that point you have to take pretty swift action, because that's something, you don't want to lose what you're built in terms of culture over a period of time.
Yeah, that last point about talented, but they challenge the core value. I'll come back to that later, because there's definitely other sort of areas where there are challenges with that. I mean, just from our perspective, as a supply chain employer of record, obviously we are recruiting and employing people for, who we sort of help to manage here on the ground from an HR point of view. But it's also really can depend on the clients and our clients and the companies overseas and what their core values are. And sometimes, we don't necessarily turn down clients because of their sort of cultural fit, but there are definitely some red flags where, at least when it comes to their HR process, that maybe they also might not have the right cultural fit. So some clients sort of ask about, working in the same time zone as their company, or maybe they want us to try and just pay them without social insurance to save money and stuff like that. And that sort of, for us, is probably a red flag that also their sort of workplace culture is not the best.
Yeah.
But yeah, so no, that's a really interesting point. And just going back to the structure, I mean, so obviously as you focus on Amazon FBA and that's developed e-commerce and retail and tech savvy, but what sort of in your operations here, what do you have which is internal, and what sort of functions do you outsource? Like, say, obviously sourcing is a core part of it, but how about sort of quality and logistics and testing? And
Absolutely. So a company name, IMEX Sourcing Services, is a bit misleading, because it puts sourcing right in the middle of it. But in terms of our workload, I think sourcing is about 15% of our workload.
Oh, okay.
So it's essentially an outsourced supply chain management service. And sourcing is the easy bit, because we have a very refined process for it. It works. A lot of time is spent on the production management, because as we worked with clients over the years, there's a lot of repeat orders happening. They need, contract, the quality control processes. So all of that is in-house. Anything to do with starting from the due diligence, we have a due diligence process running that even before we, talk to factories about price and product. Then the sourcing, then it comes to contracts. So a lot of our clients want exclusivity agreements with factories, or especially when they've scaled to a certain level, they want that. So we do a lot of that. To some extent, parts of IP protection to make sure that the factory is not selling that product to someone else, or it's not leaking through unofficial channels. So we do that for the client. And then the inspections at the factory, we also do that. The parts that we outsource, so pretty much anything that is core to the service we provide is in-house. And then the parts we outsource are the ones where you need more specialized knowledge, or you need multiple people to be able to perform that role with that specialized knowledge. So compliance is a great example of it. A lot of our clients come to us and they are like, hey, I want to make sure that the product is compliant as per EU standards. So we tell them, but what are the standards? And most of the time, the clients don't know, and
Yeah.
and they expect us to know, and we know for many products at a high level, but we don't guarantee that because compliance is a field in itself. There's a lot of new laws coming in. There's a lot of text to read. It's very technical. So what we normally tell our clients is that our role on the ground is to enforce the compliance standards that the client has set, because we're working across different geographies, but not to set the client standards. That's the job of a compliance consultant. I emphasize this because there's a lot of confusion, and most importers are kind of taking an 80-20 approach to it. So largely whatever they understand of compliance, they go with that because compliance can be expensive. Just hiring a compliance consultant can be quite pricey. What else we outsource? So lab testing, again, it requires specialized tools, equipment. There are very big players in this, so TUV, STS, so we outsource that. Inspections, sometimes we have to outsource if it's in certain remote areas, but in key areas we have our own inspectors. So I think those would be the big ones.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So I want to move on to SOPs in sourcing and operating here. So, and I know that you definitely come across as very sort of process driven, and we've discussed this in the past. So, can you tell me a bit really how you've structured your SOPs and what do they cover, what don't they cover?
Absolutely. So SOPs we have built over time around pretty much everything we do. So your sourcing, due diligence, quality control, production management, we processes for all these key areas. And then even for some of the softer skills like negotiation, so we try to, so when it comes to something like negotiation, for example, we prefer to have best practices instead because it's very case specific. How much leverage you have in a situation, what's the state of the industry, how unique is the product, and a whole host of other things. So for certain areas, we have very detailed best practices, but pretty much everything else that is repeatable. So I think our core philosophy there is anything that is repeatable should be, documented as a process.
Yeah, and do you regularly get sort of, I wouldn't say challenges to the SOP, but outliers to the, do you get that often where, you just tell them to stick by this? Are you constantly sort of updating them, or how do you see that?
I think that's a great question because what happens is you build a process, and as you are in a business long enough, something will go wrong at some point, and the temptation is, hey, let's go and update the process. That's what we did for a long time, and what that does is over time your processes become extremely complex and bureaucratic, and that impacts your speed and efficiency as a business. So we started kind of taking a pause when something goes wrong. Instead of just going and updating the process, now we ask ourselves, is this a repeatable scenario? How likely is it to go wrong again? What is the impact? What is the trade-off between adding more bureaucracy to the process and slowing it down for every order versus the potential risk of this happening and the potential loss from this risk? So we started becoming more mindful of that because end of the day, we are trying to balance a process that gives us efficiency, consistency, but also speed. And that's been my biggest takeaway there.
Yeah, and I guess it doesn't become very standard if you're constantly updating it. And and I mean, how do you when you see like something's something's come in and it's impacted the time and efficiency? I mean, how do you track that? Do you track that from what for feedback from your team, or what would you describe as a sort of inefficient sort of outlier?
So an inefficient outlier would be something that happened. We're running the process for 5 years. It's happened for the first time. And very often it wasn't because of the process, but it was because with every process, one thing I say about process is it should not be a complete replacement for human judgment, because you're working across products, across factories, and there will always be outliers. So the process should tell you to a large extent what to do in different situations, but at the same time you should be able to use your judgment if something slightly different happens. Because end of the day you can document for every scenario, but that is extremely inefficient because you're going to repeat that process again and again on every project, and over time this is one of the reasons why larger companies tend to move way slower than smaller companies, because their processes have become so complicated over a period of time that everything comes to a halt. And that's not what we can afford to do as a supply chain company representing our clients, because they want the right balance between speed and quality, right? So if the goods are leaving 3 months later, it doesn't matter if they're like top-notch quality if they don't get there on time. They miss their Christmas season. So how we look at these things is when something goes wrong, we have a bi-weekly meeting where both account managers and sourcing specialists will bring all cases, anything that went wrong, anything they discovered, and any proposals for update to the process. We would discuss it with the team, and they will see if that requires an update in training or in process or basically any other action we should take out of that learning.
Yeah, and about the training, I mean, how's your sort of management team? I mean, who would conduct that training? Would your managers do that, or would you do that? Or?
Yeah, so I was quite hands-on for many years, like in terms of building sourcing processes and systems. But now we have a very good supply chain manager who's again been with the company for almost 11 years. She's been very actively involved in developing a lot of those processes. So now she does a lot of that. And then we also have new product development and QC manager. She also actively gets involved if it's a QC related issue.
Yeah, so the managers in your various sort of departments would be responsible for obviously managing the change in process if there is one, and then also training their team.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And what sort of risks do you see for companies who don't implement these SOPs?
So the worst case risk is where you have major quality issues. The product turns out to be very different from what you ordered, and things just don't work out. You lose a lot of money. Supplier turns out to be a fraud. All those things do happen in China. That's like you have no process at all. You do no due diligence. That's one extreme end. But even if you have very weak processes, it leads to a lot of other issues like inefficiencies. You're spending way more time than you need to. You have minor quality issues like the packaging is not perfect, the labeling is wrong. And over time that compounds, and especially in a world of reviews, minor issues with products can lead to negative reviews, which can kill the product even before it takes off. So I think processes are non-negotiable. And the other thing is, without processes, you cannot scale the team. So if you have really good first 4 or 5 employees, but pretty average processes, you can get away with it because the talent of the team will kind of cover for the lack of process to a large extent. But as soon as you start getting bigger, even when you cross 10 people, for example, then those gaps will start showing because your top people will be very busy. Not everyone would be equally skilled. You'll have junior assistants who will make more mistakes. So then the system starts to break down and you have more issues.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, I mean, the worst case scenario, of course, quality and compliance and not following those SOPs. But like you said, time efficiency, scalability, and managing your team, all really key risks of not having SOPs in place. So, we were talking earlier about, you were stuck outside China during COVID. And so, but the show went on with your business and your team here, continued. So that must have been largely down to the management and process that you put in place, right?
Yes, that was, so before that happened, in the few years prior, we had invested a lot of time in building our ERP system. It's very customized for our business. Spent a lot of time training the team to use that. Initially, that was hard because we had the system, but people didn't always want to use it in the way we wanted them. sometimes requires a lot of data input, which is not the most exciting part of people's job. So we had those challenges, but it gradually worked. We created the right incentives for the data to be correct, and I think that was a huge reason why I was able to be away for the business for quite a long period of time, and things worked smoothly. And it actually also, I mean, on a personal level, it made me realize that very often I was the bottleneck because when you're a founder in a business, you've done everything at some point yourself, so you're very keen to get involved and solve problems. But when you're away from the business, in that time, one thing that happened was systems worked, but the other thing that happened was I was able to give more authority to our managers, and they stepped up and they grew as managers, and that even after coming back made my life so much easier, because then I could focus my time on more strategic issues and other issues.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, as an entrepreneur, I mean, to sort of get to that level, and especially you got to that level at such a critical time when COVID sort of sunk a lot of businesses. So, did you build your ERP like sort of it's not an off the shelf from a software company? Did you sort of
we got we didn't build from scratch. We got an open we got an open source solution, and then we customized it quite a bit to our needs. So compared to there are two routes: you go the open source route or you go the subscription route. But with the subscription options, you have limited customization options, right? So whereas with open source, you can develop it to be whatever you want it.
So you mentioned it earlier about career progression, and obviously in a smaller company having that being relatively limited compared to a large company. But when do you see real value in sort of promoting someone or raising their salary? What are you looking for, or what has to happen for that?
I think it is, for me, it's really about the value they bring and how much of what I was doing they can replace in some cases, or how they can scale what they were doing already. So they're managing a bigger team. They are able to build their own processes and systems. So that's higher level skills. So that justifies it. So it essentially boils down to the value they bring, and that can be in different forms. It can be in their ability to lead the team, manage a bigger team, build systems or processes, or replace core parts of the work that I was doing personally. If any of that happens, you see, you see there's a good reason to promote them. And in our company, we have promoted people in 6 months, and then we have not promoted people being there for 3+ years. Because what I realized is we don't really look so much at experience or time spent in the company. It's really about the value they're creating. And some people just move really fast, and others take their time to create that kind of value. And this is also where, how much they're investing in themselves makes a huge difference. So if they are attending industry conferences or reading books and all, they're kind of moving at a different pace to someone who is just learning purely by experience. Because, my take on experience is it's a very slow way to gain skills and learn about something.
It's also a very narrow way of learning, because the experience in your company is what you're doing here, and of course you've got those very structured SOPs, and so I think it's probably a lot quicker for someone to get experienced into operating in your environment. But really, you'd want to see people going out and seeing how things are done in different environments, or like you said, industry conferences, or research. And research can be online, it can be reading books, it could be all sorts of ways, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And when you're not doing that, you don't challenge your core assumptions or even the current processes. So one of the things I tell my team is, constantly challenge the current process. Like, hey, what can we change in the process? What can be optimized? What can be automated? Or what can be removed from the process? Maybe you build steps into the process because something went wrong back in the day. But now, because other things in the process have changed, the probability of that happening is very low. But still, people are doing that because it's part of the process. So it's equally important to think about what can be removed from the process. And sometimes when you are, educating yourself about your industry from external sources. You challenge those assumptions that you might just be holding because you're in this company.
Yeah, and it's important, I think, to a degree that people do sort of bring in sort of outside experiences and challenge it in ways, because that's definitely part of the reason why you bring in experienced professionals. And I mean, we know from our recruiting, you can get a sourcing professional, let's say, with an expected salary of such a huge range. It could be, it could be 8,000, 10,000, it could be 20,000, 30,000, and and everything in between, R&B per month. But like, what do you? I mean, not necessarily when you're in your business in general, but when you're looking at people's expected salary, what do you think justifies, a higher salary in that respect?
I think I would kind of go back to what we spoke about earlier, like the value that they're creating. So for example, a junior sourcing person or a merchandiser might be able to follow the SOP as it is. As soon as something new comes across or a new scenario comes across, they get stuck. They have to go to the manager to ask for, hey, how do we deal with this? Then at your next level, you have someone who is able to navigate that process, but also navigate around it when, slightly different scenarios come up. Then you have someone who's capable of building processes from scratch, right? Then you have someone who's capable of building processes and systems, but also manage people really well and bring the team together. That's a much higher level person. So I think, there are different levels, and it boils down to what you're trying to achieve with that person.
Yeah, that's true. And I guess a higher salary, would warrant higher responsibility. I mean, sometimes we're recruiting, and obviously there are people who are very experienced, but maybe the role itself doesn't have all of that level of experience, like doesn't have the management of people, or doesn't have the, necessarily sort of building SOPs from scratch. I mean, I think a lot of the people that we do employ do, at least it might not be on the JD, but do have to sort of build SOPs locally, because sometimes they're the first hire that, our clients are, their first employee on the ground. So they are sort of working in a new way. But that is interesting about the team. Yeah. So Ash, I know, before we were talking about how, IMEX is really helping companies outsource their supply chain management, and Kinyu, our company, really they're outsourcing their supply chain focused HR and building their own team. But I think definitely one thing in common that our clients might have had is they've had maybe a bad experience trying to have someone on the ground here and not hire them properly or not manage them properly. And, one of the things that we always say is it's really, there are a lot of risks in terms of, having someone on a contractor basis or an agent, and not employing them compliantly and not managing them properly. And obviously, our solution is to have a compliant HR process, and your solution is to, obviously, you have your own team, and your the whole supply chain process is outsourced to and under your management. So, but how have you sort of found, have you had clients who have had that challenges in the past?
Yes, that's a great question. And I think it's a relevant question because when you're working in the developing world, sometimes, the definition of what's ethically acceptable and not acceptable can be very different. It varies a lot by culture. So there are certain, I think I can maybe share a story that something that happened with us. We had a client who worked with for many years. Everything worked well. And at some point they started, they felt that maybe our fee was a bit high. So they wanted to go on their own. And they thought that the easiest way to do that was to hire our account manager who was managing the account because he knew the history and all. So not the best approach, but so they did that. The guy had worked in a company for many years, worked well, was very efficient. What ended up happening was, so with hiring this person, they hired him as a contractor and not as an employee. Because then the mindset was, hey, if I hire this person as a contractor, then I don't have the social insurance obligations and all that. So essentially now this person is an independent contractor, or they're an entrepreneur in their own right? So a few months into that, we started getting factories approach us saying that this person wants kickbacks, and he's really putting a lot of pressure on us. And he even wants kickbacks on the orders he had managed while he was working at our company, which was, to me, just sounded insane.
Yeah.
So we have always had a lot of processes for these kind of things, multiple levels of checks. I mean, we really filter for integrity in our hiring, because in this industry, that's critical. But also, once the team is in place, we have processes to ensure that, no such incidents happen. And we've been relatively good at that. But so we started getting feedback about this. We thought about informing the client, but then we were also worried that they might think we are saying this because they are no longer working with us. So we thought they will gradually figure this out. And also this person had taken with them a couple more employees from our company. So it was...
Oh, really? So he'd built his own team?
Essentially. Yeah. And it was all a remote team. Everyone was working from home. And gradually, somehow, I had another conversation with... so this guy was still... we developed a good friendship and all, despite all that happened. So I had a conversation with him 3-4 years down the line. And I discovered that that person was still working for them. And I was quite surprised that I thought, over time, this thing would come out. This cannot be sustainable, right?
And the factories did the factories not inform the...
The factories did inform the client, because the challenge is when they worry about losing the business, because this person wields so much power. This person's the main guy on the ground.
Yeah, of course.
He could switch the factory. So the factories don't want to take that risk, because here this person could be asking like 2-3%, but they can still make up for that in their margins. So gradually they just resigned to the fact that this is how we have to do business with this client, right? So they were paying a hidden markup, which they didn't realize. But more importantly, there was the additional risk of quality issues, because then you're not really working for the client. The salary he was making from the client was a fraction of what he was getting from the factory. So now his loyalty shifts towards the factory. So quality issues go unnoticed. Their pricing will always be the most competitive, because you can, ensure that the quotes from other factories are always higher.
Because he's obviously probably controlling the quoting process.
Absolutely. Yeah. Or you can even, there's so many other things, a person in charge can do. You can change the RFQ so that the quote comes out higher, right? So anyways, they had these challenges. I was just shocked. So I shared with the client that this is what we had heard from the factories, and you might want to investigate this. And then they ended up investigating this, and they realized that over that 4-year period, it was millions of dollars in kickbacks.
Millions of dollars.
Yeah, because he was managing, he would spend with a 4-person team. He had a kickback on every single order.
Yeah.
And you can just imagine the losses to the client, but also how much it impacted their supply chain overall. So this is the risk, and especially when you don't have any processes and systems to verify the pricing. And I think this tends to be a slightly bigger risk. One, when there's lack of processes, and two, if there is no management involved. If essentially someone's managing a multi-million-dollar purchase spent independently of any supervision and management, it's a significant business risk. I think not just in China, this would be in most places in this industry.
Yeah, that guy is sort of masquerading as the employee or the team of that company on the ground. Really, yeah, like you said, entrepreneurial, but he is essentially, I guess, did that client sort of almost outsource all the decision making to that person? was that person responsible for like selecting the supplier and selecting the price and selecting everything? Did that client, I guess they didn't have very much oversight because, they obviously they give this responsibility to you because, like we said, they outsource their supply chain function to you. So were they essentially trying to replace that with their own team?
So essentially, so if there's something like this happening in a company, there's multiple people involved in any transaction. There's a sourcing specialist, there's an account manager, there's a sourcing manager, and they all have visibility into what's happening, what's the discussion. If something like that happened, we have terms in the contract where if a factory was ever giving kickback, they would be blacklisted in our system, would never do business with them, and a whole host of other things that they're required. Even if they were approached, they're required to proactively approach us and notify this. And if they fail to do that, it's factory's responsibility, and they will have to compensate us like a 5x the amount. So we have a lot of process. These are just a few of them. So factories can't afford to take that kind of a risk. But in this case, they had management in the sense that their management was sitting in the UK. So this person could significantly influence their decisions because he's the person on the ground in China. So if I am reporting that this is the best quality at the best possible price, most likely you'll get an affirmative decision, because the management is making decisions based on the data you are providing them, right? And you can influence that data. So that was the issue. The second thing I mentioned about the contractor thing is because when they discovered this and they wanted to take police action, they couldn't because the police said that you have to provide documentation to prove that this person is an employee of your company. And the contract very clearly stated that this is not an employment position, you're working as an independent contractor. So that saving in social insurance and other costs came back to bite them because they couldn't take legal action against the employee because he was acting like a contractor and his stand was that he had the right to
it's not under. That's one thing is when you work with a contractor, it's under a different set of laws. It's under a civil code. Whereas if it's an employment relationship, it's under the labour law.
Yes.
And that's what I've always said. We always say on I've had several videos and podcasts, and the labour law protects the company just as well as protects the employee. Of course, labour law is very employee friendly here, but when it comes to instances like this, it's actually very protective of the company. I mean, it would be a completely different situation had they had a proper employment relationship. But also, like you said, it's that was that's the other thing. I mean, a contractor is not working for the client; they're working for themselves.
Yes,
and it makes perfect sense. If they. As obviously they broke a lot of moral codes by really, cheating against their alleged, employer. But they are working from themselves. I mean, Airbnb double dips, on each side. So it's a lot more difficult to enforce and to manage. But also just like you said, the decision making was still done in the UK, but it is, very much, like you said, being backed up by the data of the team that they sort of trusted on the ground.
Yeah,
and it is really important to have sort of checks and balances over that, and I think it's a really interesting story. So really, I mean, like the takeaway from that story is, they probably shouldn't have left you in the first place, but it's understandable if people want to hire their own team on the ground, but they must do it properly and they must have a real structure to do that. So, but also, I mean, you mentioned earlier about talent versus cultural fit, and how you come across very talented people, but if they're not quite right for your business, then, it's not right. And I do think that when we've recruited people, you do come across people who are very talented, but you get that scent of entrepreneurial as well, which can seem like a good thing, especially if you're in the UK or in the US and very remotely, and you've got someone who's got, those ideas and, I can manage this, I can sort this, I can do that. And it looks like a perfect solution. But I always find that those people who have that entrepreneurial, vibe, I think there are risks to that as well. Like, will they fit into your culture? Will they fit into your process? Especially if you're hiring remotely. So, and I think we've interviewed people like that, and that person was probably very much fit the bill. And it's definitely one that when you're recruiting in China is talent is one thing. English speaking ability is also something that is very attractive from the off, but you really have to do more sort of detailed approach to sort of who are you actually hiring in your company.
Yeah. I think those are some great points. And with hiring entrepreneurial candidates, I think it's a very difficult decision, especially for SMEs, because you want someone who can do a lot because you're always stretched for resources. But at the same time, you have concerns around, how stable this person would be. So I think if you can create roles where this person can operate as an internal entrepreneur, then that is an ideal environment. So they have a very strong incentive-based element, and they can run a team and grow it. And if they can grow with the company, then that's great. But the onus is really on the company to create that environment, because if you put that person in a wrong environment or in a very standard fixed salary kind of a structure, then it normally, in my opinion, doesn't end very well. So I think these kind of people are still great. You just have to create the right environment for them, for it to be a win-win for both the candidate and the company.
Yeah, you want to create entrepreneurs, who sort of develop and flourish within, as opposed to. Of course, people can have, they can have their ideas, and in a way, we should encourage sort of entrepreneurs and people going out and setting their own business. But really, the balance has to be right in terms of following the company and the progress of the company, as opposed to what their individual desires might be.
Absolutely. I think, and not every role would be a fit for this kind of a person. It has to be a very specific role in a company that has very specific. For example, you want to grow a new segment from zero. This person could be great for that, as long as a strong incentive align. But if you're looking for a supply chain manager to just ensure quality, consistency, and stuff, you already have established processes. Maybe this person would be less of a fit for a role like that.
Yeah, and entrepreneurs can be impulsive. They can act and in ways, which I think in many ways entrepreneurs have to be like that. But that sort of does go against that sort of process-driven approach that we need, that companies need for a successful sourcing operation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And also you mentioned about, incentives and rules and sort of how to do things. How does that look? Can you give an example? Or?
So you mean how? What do I think about creating incentive structures for different roles?
Or what you think, but also describe an incentive. Is it what sort of targets are they meeting? Is it things like, are they small incentives that can be about hitting things which you would expect them to hit, or are they sort of big incentives in terms of big projects and project milestones? Maybe give an example.
Yeah, so for me, I'm a big believer that every role should have an incentive element. In China, the general structure that everyone feels comfortable with is a 13-month salary. People do that, that's easy. But it doesn't differentiate between a high performer and a low performer. So personally, I feel how much that incentive element can vary. For an admin and HR that assistant, that could be only 10-15% of the salary. For head of supply chain, that could be 60-70% of the salary, or even more. So it depends on the amount of responsibility you're taking, but the higher level the role, the more complexity the role has, the higher the incentive element should be to attract the right people. That's my philosophy in hiring. What those incentives are would depend on what the key deliverables of that role are. So for a sourcing specialist, that would be to lower the sourcing cost over time, to get the most competitive pricing, or to avoid, quality issues, for example. Um, for an account manager, it could be to deliver order after order with a very high customer rating, So things like that, I think depending on the scorecard for that role, you would have to come up with what the structure is. But having the structure allows you to compare different people on the team with each other. It ensures that A players automatically stand out because they will hit their targets, they'll get rewarded, and they end up being more stable because they're being rewarded, so they see them being valued. Whereas the lowest performers, they're constantly missing their targets. So it makes it very easy for you to make management decisions in terms of, people doing what they're supposed to do and even exceeding that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, yeah, you mentioned about measurements, but I mean, for example, like lowering cost over time, and do you have sort of reviews of that sort of every, yeah, for example, when would you sort of sit down and look, oh yeah, these, these have gone down by, a couple of percent. I mean, how do you sort of structure?
Sure. So for example, if you were to take this example, we just say, if on a repeat order they were able to create a cost saving, they might get like a very small incentive on that savings. It could be like 2% of that saving is as a one-time incentive on that. So again, if on the next order they get it again, that's great, right? As long as the same quality standard is met. Now, if the quality standard changed and there were quality issues, then they would automatically get disqualified for that incentive. So it's little things like that. And when they create an result, so if this was not in place, a normal sourcing specialist would probably just place a repeat order. They didn't put they might not put the time and effort to do the research on component pricing, raw materials, and really pushing the supplier to constantly optimize the price. And again, you will get to a point where your price is optimized and you don't want to push it any lower because that could create quality risk. But then they can put that energy into the next product.
Yeah.
So that would be a good example, I guess.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean that incentive system is fantastic. And how do you think? I mean, our audience predominantly a Western audience. How do you think management styles from a Western aspect, how do you think they differ here? Like, what do you think doesn't really work here, and what do you think does work?
Yeah, that's a great question because management is so culture specific, and I learned the lessons the hard way because, sometimes you try and bring in management practices that you learned elsewhere and try and implement those in China, and it doesn't always work out. So one good example is in the West, people are very direct. They're more comfortable bringing feedback to you, sharing their opinions on what they agree or disagree with. In China, it's a very hierarchical culture. People have grown up learning to obey authority, not challenge authority. So it can be really hard for people to bring that feedback to you. So you have to really build a lot of trust, and you have to normalize it in your culture for people to come to you and share feedback. And that takes a lot of effort. It took us a lot of effort and still is challenging sometimes. So sometimes for a Western manager, that can be frustrating because you think, hey, the person's just following instructions, they're never bringing anything back to you because, good managers are hungry for feedback. They want to optimize and they want to learn what's happening on the ground. So that's one example. I think also in terms of building trust, so I think one big lesson I learned is in China, the definition of trust is that you won't pull any surprises on the employee, So like over communicating helps a lot. So if their performance is not great, I think this applies anywhere, but in China it's even more important. You let them know early what you think and try to, steer them in the right direction. Whereas all of a sudden, one day you come up with a performance warning, that's a surprise, and that damages trust.
I think maybe people in the West, maybe people probably have some assumption that this is coming. They probably already assume that, but here you should never assume. You should never assume that you're on the same wavelength as your employees or on your suppliers or in many aspects, really. And I think that comes with management. I think it does require very, structured communication.
Yeah. I think when you're communicating cross-culturally, it's better to over-communicate than under-communicate, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So I think another good example of this cultural difference is just because people are saying yes, it doesn't mean that it's a yes, right? So this is a common one. Everyone.
This is the big China thing. I reckon
Yeah.
a lot of people, watching would have realised that by now. I reckon.
Yeah.
But it's and that in many ways. I mean, some people just say yes because they want to take on the challenge, or it could be because they can't say no for a variety of reasons. It might not necessarily. Maybe they can do it, but maybe they don't have time, or it's all. I also think like managing people's workload. Sometimes the employees themselves might not manage that. They will work hard.
That's a great point you make. Yes, I think sometimes if they have too much workload because they're not used to challenging authority, they'll just try to take it on, and they eventually get burnt out, and then they leave. And then you as a manager feels surprised that, hey, I didn't see this coming at all. So the onus is on you to manage that workload because generally, so in the Western context, you might get some pushback early on. Your direct might say, hey, I'm already very busy, I cannot take more on. But that might not happen in China. But you still end up with the outcome that you didn't want when they come and say, hey, I can't take this anymore. It could be like just like resignation notice straight away, right? So
I know that we're constantly having to push for people to take their time off. They have leave, and sometimes if people do overtime, we really need to. We're spending a lot of time making sure they get the time off that they deserve, and that can be a very unique challenge to China. I don't think that happens a lot in other places. But I saw outside your office you have the gratitude wall, and I think you were talking about the culture and stuff. I mean, tell me a bit about that. How do you what's that gratitude wall?
So one of the things that I realized it about myself because we are always looking to optimize a business. We are very good at giving constructive feedback, or even we always very good at spotting things that are not working, but not good enough at spotting things that are working well. So we don't express enough gratitude for that. So I initially started this as a practice for myself to notice more positive things about people, and then we thought, hey, we could extend this at the company level. People are helping each other out all the time, this and that, but they don't always take a moment to stop and say, hey, this person went out of their way to help me out. So we just introduced this gratitude wall where they can write a note saying that, hey, I'm thankful to X because they did Y for me or whatever. And then they just put a note up there. And over time, these things add up. And what happens is it just shifts your focus. You're automatically looking for opportunities to notice the positive in people, as opposed to just noticing things that didn't go well, So it just leads to a very subtle shift in mindset. And I think it compounds over time. And so that's how we started this thing.
Yeah, it's a great initiative. And I know that, I don't know if you'll be able to see it in the camera, but you obviously had a very vocal role. And I know a lot of your clients are, like FBA, US is a big market. And, obviously last year, the Trump tariffs and everything was a huge impact for everyone here in China. And it must have been a big impact for your clients. How did you work as a team, to react to that? How did they react to it?
So I think it was a very interesting situation. I feel, in the lifetime of any business, these kind of challenges come, and it's very important for them to happen. Just like, with economies, you have recessions, right? Recessions are actually a good thing overall because it makes you question everything that's working. Because what happens with growth is, growth hides a lot of sins, right? That's a saying, like growth hides a lot of sins. So similarly, when you're in the growing phase, you ignore a lot of inefficiencies in the business. You don't optimize the business enough because you're growing, right? You focus on growth. So I think tariff made a lot of people think about their business models. From an importer's perspective, it was about over-reliance on China. From an exporter's perspective, it was like over-reliance on the US, right? And how people could diversify their businesses. So for us, the tariffhelp.org was more of a social project where we tried to connect US importers with service providers like ourselves outside of China. But also, I had a lot of conversations with users. We created a WhatsApp group for US importers where they were sharing strategies and ideas. And yeah, so I think overall, for us, it didn't have that much of an impact on the business itself because our US exposure was still relatively okay. It wasn't that high, but it allowed us to, question what we can do better. One, how we could diversify more, how we could optimize our business more. And also it allowed us to understand a lot about the pain points because I had a lot of conversations with US importers. And while our goal was to help them with those conversations, it also gave me a lot of insight into their pain points, which was helpful being in this space.
Yeah, I think definitely it had a huge shake. I know, to be fair, a lot of companies in China, a lot of Chinese companies have been building this. They've been diversifying. If you look at the makeup of Canton Fair, for example, and like the demographic who's visiting there, and the investments that China has made in different markets, I think it has been coming for some time. But obviously, it has questioned the sort of the heavy reliance on the US, the concentration risk on the US, but particularly with Amazon as well. Also, Amazon as a platform is a concentration risk. Do you encourage your clients to, do they grow and move, into their own channels? Do you support them with that as well?
Yes. So this is more of a marketing decision or even a strategic decision for the clients. We get less involved in how and where they sell because our role is to make sure they're getting a great product at the most optimum price. But
more like, do you see your clients doing that? Not obviously you don't help them do that, but
absolutely, yeah, no, 100%. With Amazon, there's been a lot of consolidation. So a lot of the medium-sized businesses were acquired by bigger businesses, and Amazon's become more sophisticated over time. So it's become harder for smaller businesses to still be very profitable on Amazon. So it's a combination of consolidation and also Chinese sellers selling directly on Amazon that has squeezed out a lot of the medium-sized businesses. But at the same time, I think a lot of the Amazon sellers were savvy enough to realize that they had significant risk with putting all the eggs in one basket, and they were over dependent on Amazon. So they diversified to Shopify and their own e-commerce stores, and even getting into retail. A lot of the private label brands, their ultimate goal has been getting into traditional retail. So I think that diversification's also been happening for a pretty long time because Chinese sellers started dominating Amazon, a few years ago now. So yes, that process has been on.
Right. Well, I think I'm going to sort of wrap up here. I want to ask you a couple of wrap-up questions. Obviously, if you want to, IMEX Sourcing Services is here to support you and operate your supply chain here in China. But Ash, if a company was looking to build a sourcing operation in China, what are the three most important things?
I would say have a lot of clarity into your end goal, like what do you want the operation to achieve, because that can vary. Secondly, you want to hire good people, especially if you're building it from scratch. You almost want those entrepreneurs who can build your systems and processes that are China specific, or very system oriented people, especially initially. So that's really important. And the third thing is have a lot of clarity on what you want. I think we touched a lot upon English, right? So I think one of my biggest takeaways was when we interviewed people initially, there were people who, we all know how hard it is to find good English speaking people in China. So it was very easy for us to overestimate the capacity of people who spoke good English to actually deliver on the job. Because in interviews, people who speak good English will always outshine the ones who don't. But when we created more role-specific tests, then we realized that there were amazing, very talented Chinese-speaking people who understood sourcing, understood quality control. They're very good at negotiation. They're very detail-oriented. And that completely changed our mindset, So that's one of the reasons why we split the roles. So I think it's very important to know to have your expectations right. English is an important factor, but if you can get more specialized skills and separate the roles, then that would be something I would advise. And have good systems and processes. That would be the third one. Whether you are taking it from your existing system processes, you still need to adapt it for China. But you eventually want to get to a point where the system processes give you a reliable result. And I think one more thing I'd say is, especially for Western businesses, is trust is not a replacement for process. Because in the West, a lot of things are done purely on trust, right? So that should always be there. I think trust is equally important, but it should not be an alternative to having good process.
Yeah, and just on that last point, if an employee sort of balks against the implementation of a process and thinks that it's due to a lack of trust, then that's really not the right approach. They should really welcome the process. It should make their job easier. It should mean that they've got a guide to follow of how the company wants to do it, and so they should welcome that. No, that's really interesting. 3 or 4 points. So yeah, just to summarize, thank you, Ash, for your time today. Building an operation on the ground. Of course, having the end goal in mind. How do you want your team to be structured? What functions are they going to do? How are they going to work with your team back in the UK? Hiring good people. What do they say? They say hire slowly, fire quickly, and that is absolutely true in China. I think just really make sure that your recruitment process is in depth, and you're finding all the right talent, and then you're not just taking on the person who can speak well good English over a Teams call. And systems and processes absolutely important to keep your team on the right track. It really helps with the communication. I mean, people who have poorer communication skills, maybe not just English, but also just communication skills, can much more easily follow a system and process. Now, communication skills are very important, but they're doubly supported by those processes. And yeah, absolutely. I mean, trust is important, but it is not the only factor for a successful employment relationship and operation here in China. So thanks again, Ash. And if you want to find more about Ash, we'll put his details, website, etc. in the link below. And also for us, Kinyu SEM, make sure that you like and subscribe to our videos, and we'll be back with more interesting interviews and content. Our website is below as well, so get in touch if you want to hire more people and build an operation here on the ground in China. Thank you.